Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the Top 10 Tips for Exchange 2010 Unified Messaging Design and Deployment webinar presented by TrainSignal's Microsoft Exchange Instructor and Microsoft MVP for Messaging, J. Peter Bruzzese. I'm Brian Green from TrainSignal, and I'd like to take a minute to tell you what to expect in the next hour. The presentation will take approximately 45 minutes, after which we will have 15 minutes for a Q&A session. Please feel free to submit your questions in the questions box throughout the presentation. Also use the questions box if you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, and we'll do our best to assist you. This presentation is interactive and will feature 3 quick polls. When you see the poll question appear on your screen, Peter will prompt you to answer. Just choose your answer and press the submit button, and then we'll broadcast the results shortly thereafter. Today's presentation will be recorded and will be available to view shortly after the presentation concludes at trainsignal.com/blog/webinars. We will also email you the information about how to view the recording. We'll also choose one participant from today's audience to receive a copy of Peter's Exchange Server 2010 Unified Messaging Training Course. We'll give you all the details at the end of the webinar, so be sure to stick around to the end and be sure to participate throughout. Also, we would love your feedback after this presentation. We'll send out a short follow-up survey, but also feel free to send any feedback to Kasia@trainsignal.com. That's Kasia @trainsignal.com. And with that, thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar. Here's Peter.
Greetings, and welcome to our webinar today. This is going to be an exciting topic, and we're really happy to be with you today, this afternoon, or depending on what part of the world you're in, this morning or this evening. So you already know the title. The title is the Top 10 Tips for Exchange 2010 Unified Messaging Design and Deployment. And let me just give you a little brief bio about myself so that you know who your instructor is today, and so that you know a little bit about me and why I'm actually going to be the one who is explaining unified messaging to you today. So just to get started here, my name is J. Peter Bruzzese. I'm a Microsoft MVP for Exchange with current certification acronyms including Triple MCSE, MCITP, MCTS for SharePoint, A+, Network+, INET+, CIW, and of course the others. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer and a technical author with over a dozen books that have been sold internationally to my credit, and I'm a technical speaker for conferences like Tech Mentor, Tech Ed, Connections, and others. So perhaps at some point you've had a chance to read some of my articles or books, or perhaps you've seen me live at one of these conferences. Now that's the modest bio. Let me give you a little bit more of the immodest bio. There's my extended Exchange bio. You know, Exchange has been my passion, it is my passion, and it has been for over 10 years. I've been an Exchange instructor for many years, working for training agencies as well as private corporations. I've had an opportunity to contribute to Microsoft Press books as well as to write my own books for Pearson. I started a column called Exclusively Exchange and started the exclusivelyexchange.com website, which includes tons of free content for all to view. And I participate in the Microsoft TAP program for Exchange 2010, for Exchange 2010 SP2, and now for E15. The TAP program is really a neat thing because it gives you the opportunity to see the software as it's being created, find the bugs, report back to the Exchange team, and then have them make those fixes and then get the next batch of software so that you can see if they've made the corrections. At the same time, as I mentioned, I'm a speaker for Tech Mentor, Tech Ed, and so on, and I'm a journalist for InfoWorld. I write the Enterprise Windows column, and I've done that for several years. So that tells you a little bit about me. What I need to do is get a little bit of information about you. I'd like to know where you're from, like to know some information about the work that you're doing with Exchange, what you're looking to do with unified messaging. So we're going to have 3 polls, and these are interactive. You get a chance to give your answers in there. And I'd like to know, first off, we'll start with where are you from? So you can see the various regions in the world. I'm starting to see all the answers come in. Let's see here. All right, so it looks like the majority of you are from North America and South America. We've got a grouping from Europe, Asia, Australia. Hey, that's actually pretty impressive. Here, I think you can now see the results on your screen. So that's perfect. We have a good mix from all over the world. So it was a good thing I said good morning and good evening as well. The next question I have is in relation to your experience with Exchange Server 2010. I'd just like to know, are you using Exchange 2010? Are you still working with 2007, 2003, or even Exchange 2000? Maybe, I don't have it here, but maybe even 5.5. If you're still using 5.5, you can click the 2000 as well. Obviously, support for these is, pretty much done. So, yep, it looks like everybody's voting in. So far, nobody is using Exchange 2000, and that's good. That just shows me two things. First of all, it shows me that progress is being made, and of course, everyone's moving forward when it comes to modern deployments. And it also shows me that if you are using 2000 or 5.5, oh, wait a minute, we just got 2%. All right, we'll close this out, and I'll show you what the results were there. So you can see that 60% is of our attendees are using Exchange 2010, 22% still on 2007, 16% on 2003, and we have 2% with Exchange 2000 or 5.5. All right, well that's great. I'm sure the ones that are not using Exchange 2010, they're excited to know why they might switch to it, or maybe you already know that, and you're just looking to hopefully get the funding and get the approval from management to move forward. The last question I have here, is your organization planning on implementing unified messaging? And I'm going to send that out to you just to give me an idea as to, are you looking to do it, and then when? We say 2012 because obviously 2011 is over, but if you're going to be doing it in the next couple of days, by all means select the top one. All right. Well, it's very interesting to see the results coming in. All right, so we'll close that out. As you can see, 41% say they're not sure, and 37% say yes, which is great. 22% saying no, not at this time. So perhaps after this session, the value of unified messaging will be made clear, and not just in terms of the tips and tricks, but perhaps you'll change your mind on deploying as well. All right, so that gives us a good idea as to where we're at, where everybody's coming from, and what they're working with. Let's move forward. Let's talk about the top 10 tips for unified messaging in terms of design and deployment. And we're actually going to start with the first tip being, let's go back. The first tip being selling unified messaging to decision makers. Now, why is this an important tip? Well, it's simply because it's very difficult if you have an organization that already has an existing voicemail system to get them to move to something else. I mean, if you're talking to decision makers and you're trying to convince them that it might cost a little bit of money to do this, or you're going to have to make some changes or pick up some new hardware in order to make this happen, their first question is going to be why? Why do I need to even move to unified messaging? And you can say, well, look, we're already using Exchange, and it's already a role, but obviously it's going to it's going to take some money and it's going to take some time to get this to work right. So the inclination of most these days is just to stick with what they've got. If you have a voicemail system already, just stick with what you've got. So some of the features that can really benefit a discussion like this, if you're trying to sell the decision makers in your organization, sell upper management, is to be able to drop the top 10 unified messaging features in their lap and explain how this is going to benefit them. So the first one is Outlook Voice Access. I mean, I don't know how many of you, I should have maybe done a poll to find out how many of you have iPhone 4S's with Siri, because anyone who's played around with Siri sees the value in being able to use an auto attendant to get your texts, be able to respond to texts, and so on. Well, with Outlook Voice Access, it actually goes even beyond Siri. I'm sure the Apple lovers out there didn't want to hear that. But with Outlook Voice Access, you can call into your Exchange environment, and you can, hands-free, check your email, check your calendar, adjust your calendar. You can do all sorts of things through Outlook Voice Access. So that is one of the great features of unified messaging. And so you say, well, okay, but I can check my voicemail through the through the typical voicemail call-in, and that's true. But with Outlook Voice Access, you can actually affect change. If you're going to be late for a meeting on your calendar, you can actually let the people know, hey, I'm going to be 10 minutes late. You can use the Outlook Voice Access to make changes to your Exchange environment, your inbox, and things like that. Then there's Voicemail Preview. This is an excellent feature. The voicemail comes in, and rather than just having a voicemail, you also have a transcription of that voicemail. Now, it doesn't always work perfectly. Let's be honest. If I leave a voicemail and I view it through the voicemail transcription, there are words that are going to be changed around, and maybe it won't understand my accent. I don't think I have an accent, but apparently I do according to Exchange. And so, again, it's going to be the kind of thing where it's not going to be perfect. So it's great for one thing, I personally think, and that is if you have an email or a voicemail rather that comes in, and those people that leave those long-winded voicemails, they talk for 5 minutes just to leave you a phone number, and it's at the end of the phone number, or at the end of the voice message that they give you the phone number. Well, unfortunately, you have to listen through the whole thing just to get that number, and if you don't get it, well, then you have to go through and listen to it again just to get that number. One of the nice things about a transcription is that you can see the number right at the end. You can look at the transcription in your email because that's what's provided is an email with the MP3 or WMV file, and you can look at the number itself. Now, if you don't trust the number, well, you can just click right into the email, into the transcription, and it will actually take your MP3, that's the default setting for your voice codec, and it will put the player right where that number comes in. So now you don't have to listen to the whole message just to get the number. You can listen to just the number part. So these are some really cool features that you just don't get with traditional voicemail systems. In addition, unified messaging allows for incoming fax. And so all of this provides for a universal inbox, they call it, because now you have your inbox with your email, you'll have incoming faxes, you'll have incoming voicemails, and all of that will go in your inbox. And so, again, incoming faxes is not part of a voicemail system. There are call answering rules. Here it's nice and simple for your users to be able to work with call answering rules and be able to decide if an individual calls that they want to have answered a certain way or to have transferred off to a different number, transferred to an assistant. All of these different rules can be established not just by administrators but by users. They can set their own answering rules. There's play on phone, where you have the ability to, instead of listening to an MP3 off of your system, you can shoot that over to a phone so that obviously if you're in a busy office, you can listen to your voicemail privately. And of course you can also do the Outlook voice access, so either way. There's auto attendants, which allow you to configure, you can have multiple auto attendants, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, so that you can really have an entire voicemail system being run by Exchange. And there are language packs, so that you can have different Outlook voice access attendants. You can have different transcriptions for voicemail preview, and we'll talk about that in a moment too. There are some limitations to both auto attendants and language packs, and we'll explain those in a moment. You can have message waiting indicators. This is something that may sound really simple. The reason we mention it here is because with Outlook or with Exchange 2007 Unified Messaging, the message waiting indicator wasn't included. You could reach for an outside third party to provide it, but it was a little bit messy. So with Exchange 2010, we have message waiting indicators so that when you lift up your phone, you get those few short bursts that indicate that there's a message, or if you have a light on your phone that indicate that there's a message, it works just fine. This is a deal breaker for some. In working with one company out in Tampa, they had 2,000 users. They wanted to go with unified messaging. Without a message waiting indicator, they were not going to go in the direction of unified messaging. So it's good to know that we have that. You can also have missed call or voicemail notification texts that are sent out if you have the text messaging set up in your Exchange. And there's protected voicemail. Now, protected voicemail, for those of you who have worked with any of the protected features through rights management in Exchange, you realize that there's positives and negatives to it. The positives are you can try to establish rules where certain email can't be forwarded, or email can't be, you can't copy it, things like that. But unfortunately, there's always ways around it. I mean, and the same is true when it comes to protected voicemail. You can make it so that a protected voicemail can't be forwarded onto someone else. But if you really want to, to send that voicemail somewhere else, you can find many creative ways to copy it. So it really is more of a deterrent than a complete blockage to voicemail going where you don't want it to go. So these are, in my opinion, the top 10 selling points for decision makers, because it includes features that you just typically don't get from your normal voicemail system. You may get some of them, but you don't get all of these features. And obviously the big thing from a typical voicemail system is that you're not in control. So here, as an Exchange administrator, maybe you're already bogged down. You feel like, I'm not really sure I want to be in control. But in the case of working with Exchange, being that it's something that you're already comfortable and familiar with, it may not be that bad to be in control of your voicemail system, to give you that flexibility. All right, now the next thing, the next tip that we want to talk about is knowing a little bit of telephony, because that's the biggest question that I get when it comes to working with unified messaging and Exchange. People say, but don't I have to get all involved in the telephony aspects of things? And the honest truth is you need to know a little bit. You need to know the basics. You need to understand the fact that you're connecting your packet-switched internal network to a circuit-switched network. Now, you may not even know what that means, but ultimately, back when the Internet was first, being worked up and formed with ARPANET, and they were thinking about how we're going to make this happen, the world was already connected with a network. We have a circuit-switched network that was originally analog, but now everything's been pretty much turned over to digital. And the idea is with a circuit-switched network that, if you call point A to point B, there's a direct connection established, and it stays connected so that you two can talk, you and the person that you've called. Well, with a packet-switched network, they had to change things up and really make it better for the Internet to work properly. So they did. They created a completely separate packet-switched network. Well, internally, we're using the same type of concepts and technology that the Internet works off of. We have packet-switched networks with TCP/IP. That's different from your circuit-switched network. Well, how are you going to blend these two together? Because you're blending these two different network types together. And of course we have our PBXs, which, here that's the second section. You have your PSTN, your trunk lines, your PBX. These are all telephony terms that you should have some idea about. So let's just talk about that for a minute. So you've got your public switch telephone network, right? That is, you're pretty much the lines that are coming into your organization. And you say, okay, great, I've got this. What am I supposed to do with it? Well, typically, the public switch telephone network has trunk lines that come into your organization. We call them trunk lines because it's not just one line. If it was a home, it's not. You don't get a trunk coming into your home typically. You get a line. But when you have groupings of lines coming into your home, into your business rather, to allow for multiple people to talk and work, well, those are called trunk lines. So they come into your organization and they connect to a PBX or to an IP PBX, and that's what allows all of your people to be able to call one another. It's interesting because unless your company wants to just throw money away, you normally have a ratio of lines coming in to the number of people that you have. So some go with a 4-to-1 ratio. So for every 4 people, you might have 1 line. In smaller businesses, you might have 4 lines for 4 people. But we're talking about in larger organizations, you need to have a decent ratio so that you pay for, less lines than number of people, because you're assuming, unless it's a call center, you're assuming that everybody in the company is not going to be on the call at the same time, right? So that's where trunk lines come in. All of that goes into a PBX, and a PBX manages who picks up their phone and who's calling another person within the company and who needs to actually access a trunk line that goes out of the company. So it's important for you to kind of have an idea about some of this, about the public switch telephone network and how, it's made up of telephone lines, fiber optic cables, microwave transmission links. It's made up of cellular networks, communication satellites. It's even made up of undersea telephone cables, and it's all connected by switching centers. Once you grasp that and you understand that you're connecting into this thing through devices, the next thing that comes to mind is, well, what devices do I need, and how am I going to get all this up and running? Before we talk about that, let's talk about knowing when and who to call for help. Because, again, we're saying unified messaging is all about integrating with your existing telephony system. So you have this system already in place, and you probably already have an existing telephony expert, right? Somebody has to come in and manage that PBX for your organization. And, most likely it's not you. You can't be a jack of all trades. I mean, some of you listening may also be your telephony expert. But in most organizations, we see two branches. There are those who handle IT, and there are those who handle the telephony side to things. And that's fine. So you're not really looking to start a whole new career here. And that's why I think a lot of people shy away from unified messaging. They're worried that if I begin this process, it's going to be a whole new career. I'm going to have to learn all these different terms for telephony. Well, you don't. You don't. You do need to make a careful analysis of your telephony infrastructure. And it requires that you plan carefully with your telephony expert or expert team. So the thing is, you don't have to become an expert in telephony. To know a little bit, will allow you to communicate well with the people that already are working with you. But we're not saying you should fire those people and become the telephony expert for your organization. Absolutely not. Continue to work with them. Rely on the expertise that's at your disposal. Or you might call in consultants. You might seek out new telephony consultants if you don't have one currently. You might seek out unified messaging specialists. Look for the PBX configuration notes with configuration settings that Microsoft provides for free. So once you have all of this organized and you have everything ready to go and you have a telephony expert to rely upon, what I've found is that once you get the connection made to your Exchange environment, once that is proven to be working, you're good to go. And everything else at that point is on the Exchange side. And the nice thing there is that Exchange. Whether you're working with 2007 or 2010 yet already, if you're coming from 2003, there's still a learning curve. But if you're working with 2007 or 2010, then you're already comfortable with the interface. You already understand the Exchange Management Console, and you'll be fine. There's a few new tabs that you're going to be working with unified messaging. I'm not going to lie to you and say that it's not going to be some learning involved. Of course there is. But you'll be fine because it's something you're comfortable and familiar with. The hardest part to setting up unified messaging is connecting it in with your existing PBX or IPPBX. And so that's where there are two options for integration that you need to consider. The first is, do you want to go with your PBX? Do you want to stay with your legacy PBX? Can you even use your legacy PBX? In this case, you're going to have to consider whether or not the PBX is something that you can use for, will it work with your existing unified messaging server? And so there's a list of all the hardware that does and doesn't work. But either way, if you're going to stick with your PBX, then you're going to require a voice over IP gateway. So yes, there's a purchase involved. You're going to need a voice over IP gateway in order to start making all of this work. And you would expect that. The other thing to consider is if you're not going to be working with the legacy PBX and you're saying, look, this is a new environment, I've never set anything else up, so I'm going to decide to just start this from scratch and just connect it right into my PSTN. What should I do? Well, then you should go in that case with an IP PBX. It's just better because then you avoid having to purchase an extra voice over IP gateway. You don't have to work with a legacy box. So there are two different options for integration. If you have a legacy PBX that works well, then go with the voice over IP gateway. If not, you're starting from scratch, go with an IP PBX. What does this do? It takes just what we were talking about, the circuit switch network, and it allows it to work on your packet switch network. And that's what your unified messaging server requires. So that's one of the keys to integrating. Now, in terms of how does this work if you're dealing with multiple locations and multiple situations with PBXs, let's take a look at some topology planning, and that's going to be tip number 5. So for tip number 5, topology planning, you need to have both the mailbox server role and the hub transport server role be in the same Active Directory site as the unified messaging server. Okay, now just saying that might make you think, well, if that's the case, then I'm going to have to make sure that I have in every site, every branch office, I'm going to have to make sure I have a mailbox server role, a hub transport server role, obviously then a client access server role, and a unified messaging server role in every single site in my organization. That's not what we're saying. So in a moment, we're going to show you a couple of different, a few different options on how you would set this up. All we're saying is that wherever you do put a unified messaging server, you have to have a mailbox server role and a hub transport server role there as well. In addition, you can place all of this in each physical site with a PBX, or you can simply add an IP gateway and place the servers up in the main site or headquarters, and then keep the server centralized. That looks nice in front of you when it's words, but let's look at it graphically. Okay. So here we see an organization with 3 different locations. We have New York, we have Chicago, and we have Dallas. All of them have enough people that they're dealing with a PBX. We have voicemail systems set up for all 3. Great. Well, now you decide you want to implement unified messaging. How do you do it? Well, it depends. Let's say in this circumstance, we have our mailbox server Sorry, I think I lost you there for a minute. Let's say at this point we have our mailbox server and our hub transport server all in the New York headquarters. So if that's the case, then what would we do in this case? If we actually honestly thought that we needed to put all of our servers in each physical location, well, then we would have to now set up servers in Chicago and set up servers in Dallas, right? But in this case, let's say all of our mailboxes are in New York. And Chicago and Dallas get their mailbox information out of New York. Well, obviously you're talking about an organization that's connected pretty well, and there's no problem on the WAN link side as far as getting their mail. But in that case, being that all of the calls that come in from each location have to go through their own PBXs, what you would do is you would implement voice over IP gateways for each of those locations. So one in Chicago, one in Dallas, or you can have more than one. I'm just making this simple, and ultimately all of the information would still go to your unified messaging server that has the blue circle around it there over in New York. So you don't have to set up a whole new organizational structure just to implement unified messaging. I mean, there'd be no way you could sell that to upper management, to your decision makers, if all of a sudden they were paying for a complete on-premises infrastructure in every other location. Now, there is one hitch to this. The round-trip time between the IP gateways, the voice-over IP gateways in your branch offices, and the servers should not be more than 300 milliseconds. Okay, so you might be thinking, how do I measure milliseconds? That's not something you need to be overly concerned about. Ultimately, if you have the bandwidth to deal with this on a WAN connection, side to things, you'll be fine. If you start noticing that there is a problem, then you may need to go a different way. But many organizations are not finding this to be a big problem as long as their WAN link is already not, overtaxed. So this is one option. The other option is a more involved deployment, which you can see here. In this circumstance, we're looking at each location, Chicago and Dallas, having their own mailbox servers. Now, why would you do this? Well, you might do this because let's say these 3 different locations were originally 3 different companies. And so they have their own, messaging infrastructure and IT departments and so on. You might do this because let's say there are enough people in each of these locations that you need to provide on-premises mailboxes. So if the mailboxes are for Chicago people are in Chicago, and the mailboxes for Dallas people are in Dallas, well, then the mailbox server, the hub transport server, is in that site. Well, then guess what? The unified messaging server wouldn't be in New York. You would put in the unified messaging server in each physical site. And that would be fine. In that case, that's not a difficult sell because you're still looking at a situation where they already have the infrastructure there. The unified messaging server role, well, it's an add-on role. You can add it into the mix with other servers. Now, there's some catches to that as well when it comes to virtualizing unified messaging, which we'll talk about in a moment. But let's say these were physical boxes. You can just add the role to the hub transport server, the client access server, or if you have a server that's running all 3 as a typical install, you can just add that role right in. So it's really not that frustrating to do. If you're going to use virtualization for unified messaging, well, then there are a couple of things that you should know if you're going to virtualize the unified messaging server role. Okay, so virtualizing unified messaging. Now the first thing you might be thinking is, Pete, we can't do that. We cannot virtualize the unified messaging role. Well, you may know that, and you may know that, in all honesty, you can virtualize unified messaging even before the big announcement from Microsoft that you can do it with their support. But ultimately, we've been virtualizing unified messaging since Exchange 2007, RTM, and it works just fine. The problem is that Microsoft in their support documents has said, hey, we don't support this. So when it comes to that type of a situation where they don't support it, well, then what are you going to do? Well, some folks say we don't need the support. We can do it without support and just run it in a virtualized environment anyway. But now this year, not too long ago, back in May, I believe it was, Microsoft kind of relaxed the rules a little bit, and they said, okay, fine. You can virtualize unified messaging if it's Exchange 2010 SP1. You have to install the unified messaging role on a 64-bit edition of Windows Server 2008 R2, which is kind of goofy because, you would install it on a 64-bit edition anyway of Server, but okay, they want it on R2. The unified messaging role must be the only role installed on that virtual machine. It may not be combined with any other role on the same virtual machine. So, in that circumstance, what we're looking at is, even if you have a great setup, you have a typical install and everything is great, and you want to install the UM, and it's a virtual machine. Unfortunately, if you want Microsoft support, they want you to put it on a completely separate VM. So that's something to consider. And then that VM must have at least 4 CPU cores assigned to it and at least 16 gigabytes of RAM. So they're making sure, they're doing overkill to make sure that the unified messaging server services are not overtaxed, that they don't look bad in the process. So if you virtualize the UM role and it doesn't work right, especially on Hyper-V, everyone starts to complain. They say, oh, look, this doesn't really work great, and then Microsoft looks bad. So to compensate for that, of course, it's just like the old days of IT, just add more memory. 16 gigabytes of RAM do you really need that much RAM for a UM server? Well, not really, depending on the number of people going through it. But they want to make sure that they don't look bad in the process. Now, I'll be honest with you. I've seen unified messaging installed on virtual machines, again, since the beginning. The first flavor of Hyper-V, it didn't work so great, but with the latest iterations of Hyper-V, it's working great. I've never seen a problem with it. And I've seen 2,000 users on one unified messaging server without a hiccup, without a major performance glitch, virtualized UM with less RAM than what's required. So obviously they're not in the support side to things, so this is what you're looking at on your screen is what Microsoft will support. But you can be confident that if you ran it with less, you would still see pretty decent results. It's one of the nice things about unified messaging. It's also good to note that unified messaging, it's a service. And what I mean by that is it's not something like your mailbox server where there's some really deep-rooted things involved there with mailboxes and data. And if you lose your unified messaging server, just make another one, and it'll be up and running, and it's a service. It'll just kick in and perform its work. It's one of the great things about unified messaging is that that's all it really does. It's like the hub transport role. If you lose one, just create another one, and it'll work, and everything will keep flowing. So the unified messaging server role is not super intensive in that respect. And most people, it's a set it and forget it type of situation. When you set up your unified messaging, you get your auto attendants going, you get your dial plans in place, and your IP gateway information configured. Usually you're done. That's it. Let it run from there and let people enjoy it. That's really the nice thing about unified messaging as well. All right, let's talk a little bit about availability and load balancing. That's tip number 7. So to ensure for greater availability, you would certainly consider having more than one unified messaging server. So in the scenario where we saw that we kept the UM server in New York, well, it would probably be good to have another UM server. And you would also want to have more than one IP gateway in an N+1 redundancy. Now, for those of you who aren't aware what N+1 redundancy is, this is a form of resilience that ensures system availability in the event of a single component failure. So components, that's what the N stands for, is components, have at least one independent backup component. That's the +1. So in our design earlier, our topology, we're looking at 3 different locations and 3 different voice over IP gateways. Well, obviously, if we really wanted redundancy, we would want multiple voice over IP gateways. if we really wanted redundancy, we would want multiple unified messaging servers. So it's good to note, though, that if other roles are not resilient or not redundant, then you might still have some issues. So when it comes to things like the mailbox and hub transport servers, if those go down, then you're still actually able to send, have voicemail come into the organization. The unified messaging server will wait until a hub transport server becomes available to send the messages to the mailbox server. If the mailbox server goes down, the server will still be able to accept voicemail. But if the domain controller goes down for that same site, well, then you're stuck. Then nothing can happen. There's such a deep tie-in to Active Directory that if the domain controller is lost, then you're stuck. So you want to make sure that you have redundancy with domain controllers and even redundancy with your mailbox and hub transport servers. But ultimately, if you have all of that redundancy, you should be good when it comes to your unified messaging if you have multiple servers as well. Now, adding multiple servers to the same dial plan will allow you also to load balance the work that the server does. So you round robin the calls coming in from the IP gateway. And you can also set up PBX hunt groups to connect to multiple IP gateways and then load balance those hunt groups. The hunt groups is another telephony term that you might not be aware of, but basically it's a funny term that applies to hunting for trunk lines that are available, and you can configure the hunt groups to utilize only a certain number of lines, or leave it wide open so that they can access all trunk lines. All right, tip number 8. Tip number 8 is know thy language packs. So all language packs do not offer the same features. A language pack allows you to install on top of the unified messaging server this added language pack and set of features. Now, some offer the full package with both an auto attendant and Outlook voice access transcription. Some offer only the auto attendant, and we'll discuss these in a moment here. I'm going to list out some of the ones they have. Now, what is the difference? It's not just auto attendants. If I set up an auto attendant that, let's say, is using, Brazilian Portuguese, well, that's great. I can download the language pack, install Brazilian Portuguese as the language pack, and it will then, I can set up an auto attendant where if I call into it, it will answer me in Brazilian Portuguese, which is great because now I might have an English auto attendant and a Brazilian Portuguese auto attendant. But that Brazilian language pack does not include the Office Voice Access or the Outlook Voice Access transcription piece. So if I try to leave a voicemail for someone, who let's say is Brazilian and they speak Portuguese, if I leave it in Portuguese, the dial plan does not understand the language, and so we'll try to transcribe it in English. It comes out horrible because, of course, nothing makes sense. If I'm speaking a foreign language, the English transcription is going to be terrible. So how do you fix that? Well, the Outlook voice access transcription is handled at the dial plan level. So if your users speak one language primarily, you cannot provide transcription for all languages at this time. That's one of the limitations to the unified messaging server, is that if you have a dial plan, you can only set the dial plan to use a specific language and for that transcription. Otherwise, you can configure multiple dial plans and configure multiple languages for each dial plan, and at the same time you can also configure multiple auto attendants. But in addition to this being a limitation, there's a limitation to the language packs themselves. So here you can see a language pack. They vary, but full feature language packs include pre-recorded prompts, grammar files, text-to-speech translation, automatic speech recognition, and voicemail preview. Okay, so there's all these pieces to a full featured language pack. Now, at the time that we're talking here, right now, we only have English, the U.S. English, we have French from France, and we have Italian. And these have all features. But some language packs do not contain voicemail preview. Others, like English Canada, Polish, Portuguese from Portugal, and Spanish from Spain, do have it. So this is important to note because you might be thinking in your mind, wow, this is great. And depending on where you're coming from, as we noted earlier, not everyone in this webinar is coming from the United States or from France or from Italy. So in your specific country, you may want to check to see if you have the ability to get voicemail transcription, Because if you do try to sell it to upper management and you say, hey, this is the feature that is really the selling point here, and you don't have a language pack that gives you the voicemail preview, well, then you're going to look kind of silly. We did find a workaround for Portuguese. If you're a Brazilian Portuguese, if you're in Brazil, and you use the Brazilian auto attendant, well, that's great. For calling in, you'll get the Brazilian auto attendant. But if you want transcription, you can change the dial plan. You can download the language pack for Portuguese from Portugal, which is a different flavor of Portuguese in terms of the language, the flavor of the accent, but the transcription will work just fine. So that's probably the only one where there's some kind of a kind of meet in the middle type of solution there for language packs. But for the most part, if you have a language pack that you're using on the dial plan and it doesn't have the transcription feature, then when you do leave a voicemail for someone, it doesn't give you anything. As I mentioned, if you're using English and someone leaves a message in a foreign language, it tries to transcribe it into English and it comes out horrible. Well, in this case, if you're using, let's say, Brazilian Portuguese, and if you leave a message, whether it's in English or Portuguese or whatever, the person, they'll get their email. It'll have an MP3 in it, but it won't have any transcription. And in some cases, that's best. All right, the tip number 9 is multiple auto attendants. We were just talking about having multiple auto attendants if you wanted to have multiple languages. But another reason why you might, have different auto attendants is for other situations. So you might have the standard auto attendant that is voice enabled so that users can call in hands-free and access their email, their voicemail messages, their calendar, and so on. But let's say a person has problems with voice enabled auto attendants. I know I do. I don't know about you, but sometimes I find that the auto attendant is so annoying in that I can never seem to get out of the loop. I can never get a person. And sometimes I need to talk to a person. No doubt you find that to be the case as well. Well, what if you have another problem with the auto attendant, and that is that the auto attendant never understands what you're saying? You say something, yes or no, and they're like, can you repeat that? I didn't get that. And you do it again, and you do it again. Eventually you're just like, come on, just give me a real person. Well, another option is to create a secondary auto attendant called a DTMF, a dual tone multi-frequency attendant. And what's nice about this is there's two great things about setting up a DTMF attendant. The first is if a person, let's say, doesn't know how to call into the DTMF and they call the voice-enabled one, and let's say after 3 problems with the voice-enabled auto attendant, where it doesn't understand them, if you have a secondary auto attendant that is, using the touch tone pad, that's what a DTMF is all about, by the way, where you can use your numbers. Click 1 for this, click 2 for that. Well, in that case, it will automatically roll them over. If you're on the voice enabled and it doesn't understand you 3 times, it will automatically move you over to the DTMF auto attendant. The other benefit, of course, is that if there's a dial-in number, then let's say you already know that you're the one person that can never get the auto attendant to work properly. Well, then don't even call the voice-enabled one. You can call the DTMF auto attendant and get all of your, all of the options in number pad. So click 1, click 2, click 3, and then you don't have to speak and try and get it to work that way. So multiple auto attendants is a great feature, but you have to set it up. You have to configure it, so you don't want to forget when you're designing and deploying your unified messaging to account for the number of auto attendants that you're going to need to configure. You might just need the voice-enabled and the DTMF, but if you have individuals that speak different languages, you may want to provide them the option to have multiple auto attendants beyond there. You can also set up auto attendants for different parts of your organization. So, you might have sales, marketing, and you can set up auto attendants for each of those departments as well, and set up holiday greetings and all sorts of fun things. So auto attendants is really one of the best features of the unified messaging server. All right. The key to recovering unified messaging. This is a good tip. Because dial plans, IP gateways, and policies and auto attendants are all part of Active Directory, you don't have to stress too much if you lose a server. It's like I said a moment ago, the unified messaging server is a service. So in that case, the service itself is really not a big problem to recover. The nice thing is that everything is in Active Directory. So all your information for the dial plans and things are there. The one thing that you do want to remember to back up are your custom prompts and your grammar files. So if you've, with the default unified messaging server, let's say welcome, is a greeting that's been recorded by who knows who, and it's been put up there as the default, but you want to change that. You want the president of the company, let's say, to record their voice and say, welcome to Globomantics. That's the one that we use in the unified messaging course that I just did for Train Signal. And we say, welcome to Globomantics. For the accounting department, press 1. For the sales department, press 2. So you might have the president of the company record this. Well, if you put that on the UM server and the UM server, gets thrown out the window and everything is lost, then it would be pretty annoying to the president to have to re-record that message because you didn't do a backup. So make sure you back up custom prompts and anything along those lines, because then you can quickly recover a UM server. To do it, all you have to do is, get the server back up and running with the same name as the original. You need to reset the account in Active Directory. Make sure you install all prerequisites and join the domain, just as if you were setting up a brand new Exchange server. Make sure all the service packs are installed. Then you would run the setup /m : recover server. And that recovers the Exchange role because all of the configuration information is in Active Directory. And then from there you restore the backed up custom prompts that hopefully you have backed up and your audio files, and then restore any global address list grammar configuration files. So it's really not so difficult to make sure you have a backup of those custom prompts. All right, so there's our top 10 tips. Well, the good news is we're running out of time, but we do have a bonus tip about voicemail codecs. The voicemail codec that is typically used is MP3, but a lot of folks ask me when I'm teaching this in a session at conferences, they say, can I switch from MP3s? You can switch. There's a few different options, but WMA provides for a smaller file size, and it maintains the quality of the call and the recording, and it also allows for increased call volume. So that's one of the other tips that I wanted to give you, that you can switch from MP3 to WMA. Something else, people ask this all the time, if quotas are a big issue, how do I deal with voicemail? And now you're going to have people leaving messages, and so people's mailbox quotas are just going to go through the roof. Well, there's a couple of things you can do to work with that. One is, of course, switching the codec so that the messages that are left are smaller file size. You can also configure policies. You can actually configure the time that people can leave messages so that they can't leave 30-minute messages. They can leave 5-minute messages. So that will reduce the file size as well. But you can configure retention policies, and you can tell your people, look, voicemails are typically ignored after a period of time anyway. So if it's important and you want to save the voicemail, save it to another location. But anything that's in your inbox is going to be, discarded every week, so that it keeps your quota in check, and this will keep them from going to their mailbox limits. So Microsoft thought about this, that, boy, this is really going to increase the size of people's mailboxes, especially if they get 10, 20 voicemails a day, and MP3s, 5, 10 megabytes per MP3. You could see how that could be a big mess. So you can use retention policies to help mitigate that, as well as educate your users to ensure that they know that they need to save these somewhere, like let's say their archive mailbox if you're using archives, or save them on their desktop if they want to save the voicemail itself. Most people, if you're me, I listen to a voicemail and I delete it. But if it's in your inbox, sometimes you don't. You just say, okay, it's just like an email, I'll leave it there. And then you start noticing that you're hitting your quotas a little bit too quick. So, folks, those are the top 10 tips for design and deployment with unified messaging. It's a lot to take in. Just some final thoughts before we get to the Q&A. IT admins are typically so pleased with themselves when they roll out a new operating system or a new flavor of Office, or in this case a super cool unified messaging deployment, but they're oftentimes vilified by their users. In other words, they're made out to be the villains of their organization for not providing appropriate training and assistance to use the new solution. And maybe you've been in that situation. Here, you just rolled out Windows 7 to the whole department, and you're thinking, I'm a god, and people are going to revere me. And what happens? Well, they come in and they're screaming at you because they have no idea how to use this new operating system. So, you give people new computers, a new operating system, a new Office, new Outlook, and now new unified messaging. But if you don't train them, well, then unfortunately they're going to hate you for it. So make sure the training is there too. Make sure that they know how to use this new voicemail system, because it's not like just regular voicemail, which is somewhat boring. there's a lot involved. There's a lot of cool stuff they can do. Make sure they're trained in using Outlook Voice Access. Make sure they know how to use call answering rules. Make sure they understand their quota issues and retention policies. All of this is essential to having the unified messaging deployment go smoothly. And it makes sure that not only are they happy, but then you will have less stress because you won't have to deal with all of those questions coming your way. So we hope that you enjoyed this today. We're going to go into a Q&A. I'm going to turn it over to Brian in a minute. But if you want to learn more about Exchange 2010, I'd like to encourage you to watch one of my training courses from TrainSignal, whether it's Exchange 2010 Administration Training. That's like my epic course with over 40 videos. There's design and deployment. There's backup and recovery. And just recently this month we released Unified Messaging Training, which I think, especially if you're listening to this subject and you're thinking about deploying it, I think you'll just love that course. It explains how to set up the dial plans, the IP gateways, the auto attendants, and all of the tips and tricks I just gave you. It shows you how to implement them in a real-world scenario. If you'd like to learn more about what I do, you can read my InfoWorld column on Enterprise Windows and there's the link there, infoworld.com/blogs/jpeterbruzzese. You can get in touch with me by emailing me at peter@trainsignal.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at jpbruzzese. Love to have some additional followers, and by all means, email me, anything that you have in the future, questions that you might have about Exchange. So at this point, I'm just going to turn things over to Brian. He's going to talk for a little bit, and then we're going to switch back over and answer a few questions.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So as Peter mentioned, we're now going to have our question and answer session, and thanks for everyone who has sent in questions already. If you have any questions and haven't submitted them, feel free to use the questions box. And if we don't have time to get to all of them on this broadcast, we can answer them via email. And if you can't stay, just a reminder, you can always view the questions portion or the whole webinar again at trainsignal.com/blog/webinars. And also keep an eye out in your email for the survey. And we'd love to hear your feedback on today's presentation. So with that, I'll send it back to you, Peter.
All right, so let's see. Let me look for questions here. And I'm going to just ask Brian to help me out with this because I'm having difficulty seeing your questions. Brian, are you still with me?
Thank you, Peter. I will submit them to you in the chat box if you're able to look at that.
Excellent. Let's do that.
Okay. Here comes the first question. It's actually from John.
All right, John, if the role needs to run on another VM, do you need a new Exchange license and new client access licenses? That's a good question, John. Okay, let me just talk about the client access licenses first because, in all honesty, anyone who, as far as your, from a user perspective, user client access licenses, anyone who is going to be using unified messaging, they're also going to need enterprise client access licenses for their Outlook. Now, on the one hand, that's a negative, and that makes people feel, like, well, I'm going to have to pay for these enterprise licenses. But there's other reasons for getting the license. It's not just for unified messaging, but if you wanted to use the archive mailbox feature and some of the other features, you would need that enterprise license as well. So, I'm not advocating the Microsoft licensing arrangement. I'm just explaining that it's not just for you do get other things. As far as a new Exchange license, for every Exchange server you set up, you're going to need, to have a new Exchange license, of course. It does run on a standard server because, again, you'll need another server too. So this is one of the frustrations of, having to run as a VM as opposed to just adding it to a typical install. That's why, although the Microsoft official side to me says do what they say and follow their rules, the side of me that knows that if you just install it on a typical install and lop it in with a bunch of others on a VM and knows that you're going to be fine with that too, and and not have to pay all the extra, well, that's to me that's perhaps a better option if you're not so worried about support. From Carlos, now that voicemail is to be sent over mail, how does it affect retention policy for compliance for those companies that are required to retain messages? That's a good question. Every company is a little different. So in some companies, Voicemail is also required to be retained, and so there are systems for doing that. But in this case, you'll have to check to see with your company as far as compliance and whether or not it also has to be retained. You know, there are some situations where it doesn't, and then it can just be discarded. And then there are other situations where if it has to be retained with everything else, then you perhaps need a I try to liken things to what Exchange provides, but I'll be honest with you, Exchange does not provide a solid archiving solution or a solid, unless you turn everything on and all of their features and you use legal hold on every mailbox, and you really don't get a fully functional compliance situation for being legally compliant with your email even. So in those situations, if you're using, let's say, a third-party solution like Mimecast, then you don't even have to worry about size and quotas, because every email that's sent and every voicemail that comes in will automatically be archived anyway. So again, check with your compliance requirements, and then from there decide if Exchange even has enough for providing that type of compliance, or if you should go to a third-party solution. All right, our last question. This one's from Fabio. I like when you use Brazil as an example in your courses. Greetings from Brazil, Sao Paulo. Oi, tudo bem? Muito bom. Yes, myself, my wife, and I, we lived for 2 years in Brazil, and so we just love Brazil. We love the culture, we love the people, and we love the language, and certainly love the food and the caipirinhas. So nice to talk to you, Fabio. I hope that you enjoy the courses. And I do. I use Brazil oftentimes in my courses as trying to show another location. So hey, we have room for one more. One more. Do we have PowerShell support for the role? Certainly, of course, yes. It's part of Exchange, and so Exchange has all PowerShell in the background there. In fact, with Service Pack 1 and Service Pack 2 now, we received some new commandlets that we can use for working with unified messaging. I addressed that mildly in the course because a lot of unified messaging is GUI oriented, but especially from a testing perspective, we have test connectivity. There's a unified messaging test tool that allows you to install a whole new set of commandlets. So, yep, we have PowerShell support. All right, look, Brian, I want one more. Give me one more. All right, let's see. Oh, we have one more. Great. I want just to know about unified messaging minimum system requirements for a testing environment. Okay, fine. Testing environment. I've run unified messaging in a testing environment on a VM that has the bare bones. We're looking at 2 gigabytes of RAM, and it's running on a single processor. And when I say testing, we're talking about just I have a simple audio codes gateway that I use to just test from one call to the other. So really bare minimum for installing Exchange and the bare minimum for and you won't even notice a hiccup. Really, I'm not advocating something that's not true in this case. It really is a great solution, and it works really, really well, even with the bare minimum. Now, I've seen the same setup run with 4 gigs of RAM with 25 users in a production environment without a hiccup. And then, like I said, with 2,000 users in a single server with, I think it was only running 12 gigs of RAM, and again, not even a complaint. For 2 years, it's been running in a physical system, and for the last 6 months, it's been running on a VM without one complaint. So pretty amazing, the unified messaging server role. I think the big thing is that people are afraid to get into the telephony side, or they have a voicemail system already. But once you get it up and running, typically you never look back. So I'm going to turn things back over to Brian, although I think he already ended things, but we'll just conclude from here.
No problem. Thanks so much, Peter. And that is all the time that we have today. Thanks again, everyone, for attending and for your participation. Those were great questions. And as I mentioned, we're going to select a participant to receive a copy of Peter's Exchange Server 2010 Unified Messaging Training course, and we will email the winner to let you know, so be on the lookout in your inbox. And as a reminder, today's webinar was recorded and will be available later this afternoon at trainsignal.com/blog/webinars. And we'll also email a quick follow-up survey, and we'd really love to know what you thought about today's presentation and any ways that we can improve. So please just let us know any feedback that you have about today's webinar. And thanks again for participation. For participating, and have a great day.